Margaret Sterling stepped out of her husband's black Rolls-Royce, her heels clicking on the marble steps of the towering Sterling Industries building. The 45-year-old woman adjusted her $5 million diamond necklace and smoothed down her designer dress. She had married billionaire Robert Sterling 3 years ago, and ever since then, she acted like she owned the world. Margaret never worked a day in her life, but she spent money like water and treated everyone around her like they were beneath her. Today, she was visiting her husband's office to pick up his credit card for another shopping trip, but she had no idea her life was about to change forever. As Margaret walked through the shiny lobby with its gold decorations and expensive art, she noticed a woman mopping the floors near the elevator. The woman was around 50 years old, wearing simple blue work clothes, and had her graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. She was black, quiet, and focused on her work, moving the mop in steady circles across the already spotless marble floor. Margaret wrinkled her nose in disgust and let out a loud, mean laugh that echoed through the entire lobby. She looked at the cleaning woman like she was looking at something dirty on the bottom of her shoe. "Excuse me?" Margaret said in a voice dripping with fake sweetness, snapping her fingers like she was calling a dog. "You missed a spot right there. I can't have dirty floors ruining my expensive shoes." She pointed with her perfectly manicured finger to a spot on the floor that was already sparkling clean. The cleaning woman looked up with kind, tired eyes but didn't say a word. She simply nodded and cleaned the spot again, even though it didn't need cleaning. Margaret smirked and shook her head, feeling so proud of herself for putting this woman in her place. "Some people just don't know their place in this world," Margaret whispered loud enough for everyone in the lobby to hear. She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of her own reflection in the clean floor, completely ignoring the woman who had just been humiliated in front of dozens of people. Security guards, other employees, and visitors all watched in silence, feeling uncomfortable but not knowing what to do. The cleaning woman kept working without saying a single word, but if anyone looked closely, they might have seen a small, knowing smile cross her face for just a moment. Margaret finally got into the elevator, still laughing about what she thought was her clever joke. She pressed the button for the top floor where her husband had his enormous office. As the elevator climbed higher and higher, Margaret felt more and more powerful. She loved being married to a rich man because it meant she could treat people however she wanted and never face any consequences. She spent her days shopping, going to expensive spas, and looking down on anyone who had to work for a living. But Margaret had no idea that everything she thought she knew about her life was completely wrong. When the elevator doors opened on the top floor, Margaret was surprised to see her husband, Robert, pacing back and forth in the hallway, looking more worried than she had ever seen him. His usually perfect gray hair was messy, his expensive suit was wrinkled, and he was sweating, even though the air conditioning was on full blast. Robert was talking rapidly into his phone, saying things like, "I don't know what happened, and we need more time to figure this out." When he saw Margaret, he quickly hung up the phone and tried to force a smile, but she could see the fear in his eyes. "Honey, what's wrong with you?" Margaret asked, suddenly feeling nervous. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Did something happen with the business?" Robert took a deep breath and led her into his office, which was usually filled with confidence and power, but now felt cold and scary. He sat down heavily in his leather chair and put his head in his hands. For the first time since Margaret had known him, her billionaire husband looked small and defeated. "Margaret, I need to tell you something, and you're not going to like it," Robert said, his voice shaking. "The company is in serious trouble. We've been losing money for months, and I've been hiding it from everyone, including you. I made some very bad business decisions, and now we might lose everything." Margaret felt like someone had just poured ice water over her head. Her perfect world of shopping and luxury was suddenly cracking apart like glass. "What do you mean we might lose everything?" Margaret's voice rose to a scream. "We have billions of dollars. We have houses and cars and jewelry. How can we lose everything?" Robert looked up at her with eyes full of regret and fear. He explained that he had borrowed money against everything they owned to make risky investments that failed. Their houses, cars, jewelry, and even the clothes on their backs all belonged to the bank now. They had exactly 1 week before they would lose it all. But the biggest shock was still coming. Robert told Margaret that Sterling Industries, the company that made their fortune, was being sold to pay off their debts. The new owner would take over everything, including the building where Margaret had just been so cruel to the cleaning woman. "Who bought our company?" Margaret asked, feeling like her whole world was spinning out of control. Robert shook his head sadly and said he didn't know yet, but they would meet the new owner in just a few minutes. As if on cue, there was a gentle knock on the office door. Robert called for the person to come in, and Margaret turned around expecting to see some boring businessman in a suit. Instead, the door opened, and in walked the same black woman who had been mopping the floors downstairs. But now she wasn't wearing work clothes. She was dressed in an elegant business suit that probably cost more than Margaret's car, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who owned the world. "Good afternoon, Mr. Sterling," the woman said in a voice that was calm, strong, and educated. "I'm Dr. Sarah Washington, and as of today, I am the new owner of Sterling Industries." Margaret's mouth fell open so wide that she almost choked on her own spit. This was impossible. The cleaning woman couldn't be a doctor. She couldn't be rich. She couldn't be the new owner of their company. But as Dr. Washington sat down across from them and placed a stack of official papers on the desk, Margaret realized that everything she thought she knew about the world was wrong. Dr. Sarah Washington wasn't just rich. She was one of the richest people in America. She had grown up in poverty, worked 3 jobs to put herself through college, and built a technology empire worth $20 billion. She owned companies all over the world. But she had a secret that nobody knew. Once a month, she would disguise herself as a cleaning woman and work in different buildings that she was thinking about buying. She wanted to see how people treated workers when they thought nobody important was watching. "You see, Mrs. Sterling," Dr. Washington said, looking directly at Margaret, "I believe that how someone treats people they think are beneath them shows their true character. I was downstairs cleaning floors to see what kind of people worked in this building before I decided to buy it. And I have to say, your behavior today was quite educational." Margaret felt her face turn red with embarrassment and shame. She tried to speak, but no words came out of her mouth. Dr. Washington continued in her calm, powerful voice. "I've seen many wealthy people in my life, Mrs. Sterling, but I've rarely seen someone be so needlessly cruel to another human being. That woman you laughed at and humiliated was me. And now I own everything your husband built, including this building, this office, and unfortunately I have to deal with his debts." She opened the folder and showed them papers that proved she now controlled their entire lives. "Please," Margaret finally managed to whisper, tears starting to fall down her cheeks. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I made a mistake." But Dr. Washington held up her hand for silence. "Mrs. Sterling, I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad. I'm telling you this because I believe people can change and I believe everyone deserves a second chance. Your husband's company failed because he forgot that business is about helping people, not just making money. And you've forgotten that being wealthy doesn't make you better than anyone else." Then Dr. Washington said something that shocked both Margaret and Robert. "I'm not going to destroy your lives, even though I probably should after the way you treated me today. Instead, I'm going to offer you both something much more valuable than money. I'm going to offer you the chance to learn what real success looks like." She explained that she would pay off their debts and give them both jobs at her company, but they would start at the bottom and work their way up. "Mrs. Sterling, your first job will be cleaning floors in this very building," Dr. Washington said with a slight smile. "And Mr. Sterling, you'll be working in our mailroom. You'll both earn minimum wage, live in a small apartment, and learn what it's like to work for everything you have. If you can do this for 1 year without complaining, without quitting, and while treating every person you meet with respect, then I'll consider giving you better positions." Margaret wanted to scream and say no, but she looked around at the office that was no longer theirs and realized they had no choice. They could accept Dr. Washington's offer or they could lose everything and end up homeless on the streets. "Why would you help us after the way I treated you?" Margaret asked through her tears. Dr. Washington's expression softened, and for the first time she looked at Margaret with something like kindness. "Because 25 years ago I was a young woman working as a real cleaning lady to pay for college," Dr. Washington explained. One day, a wealthy woman just like you humiliated me in front of everyone in a fancy hotel lobby. She made me feel small and worthless, and I went home that night and cried for hours. But instead of letting that experience destroy me, I used it as fuel to build something better. I promised myself that if I ever became successful, I would use my power to help others learn and grow, not to hurt them. Margaret felt ashamed, but also amazed. This woman had every right to be angry and vengeful, but instead she was offering kindness and a second chance. "I accept your offer," Margaret said quietly. "And I promise I will work hard and treat people better." Robert nodded agreement, still too shocked to speak. Dr. Washington smiled and stood up, extending her hand to both of them. Over the next 12 months, Margaret Sterling learned more about life than she had in her previous 45 years. She cleaned floors, emptied trash cans, and scrubbed toilets in the same building where she used to walk around like a queen. At first, it was the hardest thing she had ever done. Her hands got sore, her back ached, and she wanted to quit every single day. But slowly, something inside her began to change. She started talking to the other cleaning staff and learned about their lives, their families, and their dreams. Margaret discovered that Maria, the woman who cleaned windows, was studying to become a nurse. She learned that James, who emptied the trash, was raising 3 children by himself after his wife died. She met dozens of people who worked hard every day to take care of their families and still found ways to be kind and helpful to others. For the first time in her life, Margaret realized that these people weren't beneath her. They were actually much stronger and more admirable than she had ever been. As the months passed, Margaret and Robert both changed completely. Robert learned humility working in the mailroom, and he started coming up with ideas to help the company treat its workers better. Margaret not only became an excellent cleaner, but she also started a program to help other employees continue their education. Dr. Washington watched their progress carefully, and she was impressed by how much they had both grown. On the last day of their year-long trial, Dr. Washington called Margaret and Robert into her office. "You've both exceeded my expectations," she said with genuine pride in her voice. "You've learned that true wealth comes from how you treat others, not from how much money you have in the bank, Margaret. I'm promoting you to head of our employee development program, where you'll help other workers achieve their dreams. Robert, you're going to lead our new division focused on ethical business practices." But Dr. Washington had one more surprise. She handed them each an envelope containing stock certificates that made them both millionaires again. "This isn't charity," she explained. "You've earned this through your hard work and personal growth. But remember, with wealth comes responsibility. Use your money to lift others up, not to put them down." Margaret started crying, but this time they were tears of joy and gratitude. She had lost everything material, but gained something much more valuable. She had learned how to be a good person. She hugged Dr. Washington tightly and whispered, "Thank you for seeing something good in me when I couldn't see it myself." From that day forward, Margaret Sterling became known throughout the business world. Not for her designer clothes or expensive jewelry, but for her kindness, her generosity, and her tireless work helping others achieve their dreams. Years later, when people asked Margaret about the most important day of her life, she would always talk about the day she met a cleaning woman who turned out to be a billionaire. But she would quickly add that the woman's wealth wasn't what made her special. What made Dr. Sarah Washington special was her ability to see potential for good in everyone, even in people who had forgotten how to be good themselves. Margaret learned that the most powerful thing you can do in life isn't to look down on others, but to lift them up. Because when you help others rise, you rise too. And that lesson, Margaret would say with a smile, was worth more than all the diamonds in the world. Years after that life-changing day, Margaret Sterling had become a completely different person. She now lived in a modest but comfortable home and drove a simple car to work every morning. Her closet was full of professional clothes instead of designer gowns, and she wore her grandmother's simple wedding ring instead of expensive jewelry, but the biggest change was the joy in her eyes and the genuine smile that never left her face. Margaret had discovered something she never knew existed, the happiness that comes from helping others succeed. Her employee development program had grown into one of the most successful initiatives in Dr. Washington's company. Margaret had helped over 300 workers get college degrees, learn new skills, and move into better jobs. She personally mentored young people from poor backgrounds, helping them navigate the business world and achieve their dreams. Every success story filled her heart with more satisfaction than any shopping trip ever had. Margaret had learned that building others up was infinitely more rewarding than tearing them down. Robert had also transformed completely. His new division for ethical business practices had become a model that other companies around the world tried to copy. He worked with businesses to make sure they treated their employees fairly, paid living wages, and contributed positively to their communities. Robert often spoke at conferences about his journey from greed to purpose, sharing how losing everything had actually saved his soul. He and Margaret had rebuilt their marriage on a foundation of shared values instead of shared wealth. But Dr. Sarah Washington had an even bigger surprise waiting for them. On the 5th anniversary of their transformation, she invited Margaret and Robert to a special dinner at the fanciest restaurant in the city. When they arrived, they were shocked to see dozens of people they recognized. Maria, the former window cleaner who is now a registered nurse, James, the former janitor who had opened his own small business, and many other employees whose lives had been changed by Margaret's mentoring program. Tonight, we celebrate something very special, Dr. Washington announced to the gathered crowd. 5 years ago, Margaret Sterling was a very different person. She was cruel, selfish, and had no idea what real success meant, but she proved that anyone can change if they're willing to work hard and open their heart. The crowd applauded, but Margaret felt tears coming to her eyes as she remembered how awful she used to be. Dr. Washington continued her speech with a smile. Margaret and Robert, you've both exceeded every expectation I had when I gave you that second chance. You've not only transformed yourselves, but you've helped transform the lives of hundreds of other people. Because of your work, our company has become a place where dreams come true and where every person is valued and respected. She paused and looked directly at Margaret with eyes full of warmth and pride. That's why I'm announcing tonight that I'm making you both full partners in Washington Industries, Dr. Washington said, causing gasps of surprise throughout the restaurant. You'll each own 10% of the company, which means you're both billionaires again. But more importantly, you've earned the right to help me lead this organization and continue changing lives for the better. Margaret couldn't believe what she was hearing. She was wealthy again, but this time she had earned it through kindness and hard work. But the biggest surprise came when Dr. Washington handed Margaret a special folder. Inside this folder is something I've been working on for 2 years, she explained. It's the charter for the Margaret Sterling Foundation for Second Chances. This foundation will help people who have made mistakes in their lives get the opportunity to change and grow just like you did. I'm putting $50 million into this foundation, and I want you to run it. Margaret opened the folder with shaking hands and saw plans for schools, job training centers, and mentorship programs that would help thousands of people turn their lives around. There were proposals for helping former prisoners find work, assisting people recovering from addiction, and supporting anyone who wanted to make a fresh start in life. It was everything Margaret had ever dreamed of doing but never thought possible. I don't deserve this, Margaret whispered through her tears. I was so horrible to you and to so many other people. Why would you trust me with something this important? Dr. Washington reached across the table and took Margaret's hand with genuine affection. Because 5 years ago, you proved that people can change completely if they're willing to face their mistakes and work to fix them. You've spent every day since then making amends for your past behavior by helping others. That's exactly the kind of person I want leading this foundation. The celebration continued late into the night with person after person sharing stories about how Margaret's mentoring had changed their lives. Maria talked about how Margaret had helped her study for nursing school while she was still cleaning windows. James explained how Margaret had given him business advice that helped him start his own company. A young man named David shared how Margaret had helped him get out of a gang and into college where he was now studying to become a teacher. As Margaret listened to all these stories, she realized something amazing. The old Margaret had spent millions of dollars on herself and felt empty inside. The new Margaret had spent 5 years helping others spend money on their education and dreams, and she felt more fulfilled than ever before. She had learned that true wealth isn't about how much money you have in the bank, but about how many lives you've helped make better. 3 months later, Margaret stood in front of the first Margaret Sterling Foundation for Second Chances building. It was a beautiful campus with classrooms, computer labs, counseling centers, and job training facilities. Over the entrance were words that Dr. Washington had suggested. Everyone deserves a second chance to become their best self. Margaret felt proud and humble at the same time as she watched hundreds of people walk through the doors to start new chapters in their lives. The Foundation's first program was for people who had been recently released from prison. Margaret knew that these men and women faced enormous challenges finding jobs and rebuilding their lives. Just like she had faced the challenge of rebuilding her character, she worked with local businesses to create job opportunities, and she personally interviewed every person who came through the program. Margaret treated each of them with the same dignity and respect that Dr. Washington had shown her. One of the first graduates was a woman named Linda who had spent 3 years in prison for theft. Linda was a single mother who had stolen food to feed her children, and she was terrified that no one would ever give her a chance to work again. Margaret not only helped Linda find a job at a local grocery store, but she also helped her get an apartment and enroll her children in good schools. Within 2 years, Linda had been promoted to assistant manager and was saving money to buy her own house. "Mrs. Sterling," Linda said to Margaret one day, "you saved my life and my children's lives. Before I met you, I thought I was worthless, and that my mistakes would follow me forever. But you showed me that my past doesn't have to define my future. You believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself." Margaret hugged Linda tightly and thought about how Dr. Washington had said those exact same words to her 5 years earlier. The foundation grew quickly, and soon Margaret was running programs in 12 different cities. She helped former drug addicts get clean and find work. She assisted people who had lost their homes to rebuild their lives. She supported teenagers who had dropped out of school to get their diplomas and go to college. Every success story made Margaret more determined to help even more people. But Margaret's greatest success came with a young man named Marcus, who reminded her of her own son from her first marriage. Marcus was 19 years old and had been in and out of juvenile detention since he was 14. He had grown up in poverty with no father and a mother who worked 3 jobs just to pay rent. Marcus had turned to selling drugs to help support his family, but he got caught and spent 2 years in prison. When Marcus walked into Margaret's office, he was angry, defensive, and convinced that the world was against him. "I don't need your help, lady," he said rudely. "I've heard all this stuff before about second chances and changing your life. It's all just talk. People like you don't really care about people like me." Margaret looked at Marcus and saw herself 5 years earlier, full of anger and prejudice, and convinced that she was better than everyone else. "You're absolutely right, Marcus," Margaret said calmly. "Years ago, I wouldn't have cared about you at all. I would have looked at you and assumed you were just another criminal who deserved whatever happened to you. I would have been completely wrong, just like I was wrong about a lot of things back then." Marcus was surprised by Margaret's honesty, and his defensive attitude softened slightly. Margaret told Marcus her entire story, from her cruel behavior toward Dr. Washington, to her year of cleaning floors, to her transformation into someone who dedicated her life to helping others. She didn't hide any of the embarrassing or shameful parts of her past. "The point isn't that I was a terrible person," Margaret explained. "The point is that terrible people can become good people if they're willing to do the hard work of changing." Marcus listened carefully to Margaret's story, and for the first time in years, he felt something he had almost forgotten. "Hope. Do you really think someone like me can change?" he asked quietly. "I've made so many mistakes and I've hurt so many people. Sometimes I think I'm just a bad person who can't be fixed." Margaret smiled at Marcus with the same kindness that Dr. Washington had shown her. "Marcus, I believe that every single person has goodness inside them, even when they can't see it themselves." Margaret said, "You made mistakes because you were trying to help your family, not because you wanted to hurt people. That tells me that your heart is good, even if your choices were wrong. I want to help you find better ways to take care of the people you love." Over the next 2 years, Margaret worked closely with Marcus. She helped him get his high school diploma, then his driver's license, then a job at a construction company where he learned valuable skills. Marcus lived in a halfway house that the foundation had purchased, and Margaret checked on him every week. She celebrated his small victories and encouraged him through his setbacks. When Marcus got promoted to crew leader, Margaret was as proud as if he were her own son. But Marcus's biggest transformation came when he started volunteering at the foundation, talking to other young people who were making the same mistakes he had made. 5 years ago, I thought my life was over. Marcus would tell them, I thought I was just another statistic, another young black man who would never amount to anything. But Mrs. Sterling showed me that my past mistakes don't have to determine my future success. She believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. And now I want to help you believe in yourselves, too. On the 10th anniversary of Margaret's transformation, Dr. Washington organized another celebration dinner. This time, the event was held at the foundation's main building, and over 1,000 people attended. There were former prisoners who had become business owners, former addicts who had become counselors, and former high school dropouts who had become teachers and doctors. Margaret looked around the room and felt overwhelmed by the incredible power of second chances. 10 years ago, I was the worst version of myself, Margaret said in her speech that night. I was cruel, prejudiced, and completely selfish. I judged people by the color of their skin, the clothes they wore, and the jobs they had. I thought I was better than everyone else because I had money. But I was actually worse than everyone else because I had no heart. Dr. Washington could have destroyed me for my cruelty, but instead, she gave me the greatest gift anyone can give, the opportunity to become a better person. Margaret paused and looked directly at Dr. Washington, who was sitting in the front row with tears in her eyes. Dr. Washington, you didn't just save my life 10 years ago. You showed me that the most important thing we can do in this world is to see the potential for good in every person we meet. You taught me that wealth without kindness is worthless, but kindness without wealth can still change the world. Thank you for believing that even someone like me could learn to be better. The crowd gave Margaret a standing ovation that lasted for 5 minutes. As she looked out at all the faces in the audience, people of every race, age, and background who had been given second chances to rebuild their lives, Margaret felt a joy so deep that it seemed to fill every corner of her soul. She had learned that the most beautiful thing in the world isn't a diamond or a designer dress, but the light in someone's eyes when they realize their life has value and their dreams are possible. That night, as Margaret drove home to her modest house, she thought about the woman she used to be and the woman she had become. The old Margaret had lived in a mansion but felt empty inside. The new Margaret lived in a simple home, but felt richer than she had ever imagined possible. She had learned that true success isn't measured by what you have, but by what you give. And she had discovered that the most powerful force in the universe isn't money or status or beauty, but the ability to see the divine spark in every human being and to help that spark grow into a flame that lights up the world.